Yeah,
want.
yeah. Okay. All right. It was in a different spot that I'm used to. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Jennifer Evans. She owns Periwinkle Art Studio, which is now in Racine. And we're really pleased to have her back with us tonight after hosting many programs with her in the past year. And I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here with you again. Welcome back if you've done any of the other art classes with me. We are going to do geraniums, and I'm going to show you how you can modify the color. So if you want to change it up and paint your geraniums one way in red and then the next time in pink, you can have the knowledge to do that. So before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes. In a few minutes, I'm going to be putting my phone up on my tripod, so you'll be looking down at my work table, and I won't be able to see you, but I'll be able to hear you. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and interrupt, because chances are if you have a question, somebody else probably has the same one. So I prefer to kind of address them as we're going along, so that you can get the hang of watercolor strokes and everything as we're getting used to it and practicing it. And the other way you can do it is you can drop a question in the chat, and Roz will be monitoring that, and she'll be able to make sure that all the questions are answered as we go through the process. So if it's not pertinent to something we're doing right at the moment, but you want to remember to ask it, you can drop that in the chat. So before we start, are there any questions at all on the supply list or any of the materials? We are going to be using watercolor with a watercolor brush on watercolor paper. You'll need a good container of clean water and some paper towel. But does anybody have any questions about materials or specific questions about the types of watercolor before we get started? Okay, everyone's just anxious and ready to go. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm going to take a minute to get set up, and we will get started. Get my light set up. And this is a couple of samples that I brought for you all. These are greeting cards that I painted. Strathmore makes a wonderful greeting card watercolor paper with envelopes. So these are a couple of samples that I did in, different, it's the same style, but kind of different take. This is a pink one with just the cluster of the geranium head. These are more, with the greenery. And here's one that's got both kinds represented. So I'm going to set these aside. I just thought I would show you those for reference. And I do have a little geranium that I'm going to be looking at for reference. So it's great if you have a live sample, but you can always take a look at photos online for inspiration. And I'm going to do a little sample, like a warm-up exercise. So if you have an extra sheet of paper and you want to just use a half a sheet or a little corner of watercolor paper just to start out with and get used to some of these strokes, that might be a good idea. And I can't decide if I'm going to use my trusty old Pelican set here, or if I'm going to go with this travel set by Jane Davenport that's got really vibrant colors, although it doesn't have a true red. It's the only thing that I don't like about this set. It's more in the magenta and the blues and purples, but really vibrant greens. So when you have watercolors.
Jennifer, there are two questions in the chat that maybe you can just answer at this point. Someone would like to know, which brand of paints do you suggest? And the other question is, what size brush?
Okay, easy enough. I recommend any set of watercolors that's a highly pigmented set. So What does that mean? That means that something that's a basic student set might not be all that highly pigmented once you start activating them with water. So I've got, this is my Pelican set. It's Pelican spelled with a K, and it's a pan watercolor set. So all of these are going to need to be activated with water. So when I start painting any sort of a pan, this is a pan set, this is a pan set, anything that's got the pre-poured watercolor in a palette, you have to activate with water and kind of get it juicy and working. So at the very start here, you'll see me drop in some water from my brush just to get them activated and start moving that color around. Okay, so you can tell I've used this set pretty consistently for about 4 years now, and watercolor goes a long way. As you can tell, I'm not even out of any of the colors yet. The other set, if you go to the fine art store, you might see watercolors in a tube like this. This is the Core brand, QOR. It's a very highly pigmented set. If you do buy a set in the tube, you're going to need to set up your own palette, and you would need only a small drop squeezed out of the tube, maybe the size of a pea, and then work the water into it and get your palette going. So you would have your own palette. But I really do, I love the Core set. A basic set that's fine is like a Reeves. Of course, the Pelican I like. There are some great travel sets. I'm trying to think if there are any that I haven't mentioned. And then if you go into like the professional quality sets, the Daniel Smith Artist brand is going to be a little bit pricier, but it'll come, you know, set up with a palette like this with extra wells that you can go ahead and round out your set. So, you know, I would say just look for a really highly pigmented set to start out with, not something that's like a student grade, like a Crayola or anything like that. And then brushes, I'm going to use a number 12 round. So a number 10 or a number 12 round is fine. I grabbed this number 6 just for some fine detail work if I want to, you know, grab something to make a finer line. But a number 10 or a number 12 round will make a nice watercolor wash and come to a nice point so that you can ease up on the pressure and get a very fine brush stroke with that as well. Okay, so any questions about that? I'm just going to go ahead and start getting this little travel set activated, get the greens going. Okay. So the first thing that I like to do, no matter what my subject is I like to just take a look at the basic structure of the flower. So I take a few minutes and kind of study, well, what is it that I'm looking at here? And so in this case, I'm going to look at the petals that are in these little flowerets that are making up the head of the geranium. So I can count, it looks like there's 5 petals that kind of whirly-bird around each floret, and then they're connected by these little green strands, and then they have these little buds. Hopefully you can see that, these little offshoots, these buds that are going to get ready to spring up. And then, you know, there's a few little buds here. And I like to take a look at the greenery as well. So the greenery, they kind of look like lily pads, I think, with a lot of vein work in them. So I kind of like to take note of what it is I'm going to be painting and figure out the structure of that. How can I represent that with my watercolor? And I like to have my brush do any of the hard work that it can for me. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I put my brush down and kind of pivot the brush, so it would be like this if I were waving my hand. if I pivot the brush around the stem of the brush, I can kind of get close to that shape, right? Instead of painting it straight out, painting this shape, I can put my brush down and kind of sweep it and turn it and then pull it down a little bit. And that's kind of what that petal looks like. If you're practicing with me, go ahead and try that. And notice that when you're pushing the color around, if you've got your brush nice and loaded with the pigment, you'll notice that the last place your brush touches the paper is where that pigment is going to pool. So I can push that color toward the end, toward the edge of that shape so that the color stays on the outer rim of that petal. And if it just gets too saturated, I can grab my paper towel and get some of the water and the watercolor off of that brush and kind of boss that color around a little bit so that it goes into a point here that's less saturated and the colors around the outside, kind of like a fan. Do you get that kind of, everybody with me so far? So when I look at the geranium, there's going to be 3 to 5 of these petals that kind of rotate around that center. So I can either continue to make that motion with my brush by turning my hand, which might be a little bit wonky, or the easier way to do it is to turn my paper just to get a better vantage point and then go for that third floweret, third petal that way. Now, what you'll notice is where these petals touch and where they come together. Anything that's wet already, that color is going to bleed into it and travel a little bit. And this is one of the really wonderful things about watercolor, but it's also really helpful to know that that's going to happen. So if I wanted to put in just a little tiny bit of a light green, a yellowish green right in the middle where those come together, can you see what's happening there? The green is kind of splaying out into the pink and it's going to react for a few minutes. This is going to continue to kind of find where the other watery areas are and spread out a little bit. So if I did that and it took off a little bit too much, I can either blot with my paper towel, which is a little harder to do to get precise about it. The other way to do it instead of blotting it, kind of mopping it up with paper towel, is to squeeze as much moisture as I can out of the brush and then push that color back where it belongs. So if I'm doing this with kind of a dry brush, I can kind of lift anything that I don't want where it's traveled and correct that. So that's called lifting color. It's also called the thirsty brush technique. So if you want to wait, if you want to shape your petals and then wait and let everything dry until you don't see any sheen, it doesn't look shiny or anything, and then put in your center, that's certainly one way you can do it. This is all personal preference. But I think that, you know, one of the really beautiful things about watercolor is that it does kind of blend and make these really interesting effects. So to get my other petals in there, I can sneak a few around the edge just to give an idea that, you know, there's some other petals in the background, but I'm going to intentionally leave a little white space or it's all going to run together and look like a big blob. So if you're just doing this for the first time and you paint a big blob, we're going to call that practice. That's okay. It's absolutely fine. It's all part of getting to know how our watercolors are going to behave, both with each other when they're on the paper, and also how much water we need to add with our watercolor in order to get a good mixture of water and pigment ratio to get that to happen. So these little ditties down here, again, I'm just kind of laying my brush down and pulling it slightly, and that's making a little shape for the buds. And if I went ahead and painted the greenery on it, like I see, it's all going to blend together. So again, this is where I would want to either leave a little bit of white space there or let that pink dry before I introduce the stems and the greenery on that. Again, personal preference. If you want to see kind of what the happy medium and what the balance is there, by all means, play around with it a little bit, because this is just kind of a warm up and a practice run. So the last thing I want to show you here is the leaf. And again, I want to have the shape of the brush do as much of the work for me as I possibly can. So I'm going to make almost that same motion as I did with the petal, but I'm going to continue it around and make kind of a full circle leaf. So it's going to kind of look like if you were to put a whole bunch of 4-leaf clovers together. It's going to have these kind of wrinkly edges. And if I wanted to grab a real dry brush, I could try to pull some of that color out and create that vein work. It's a little bit tedious, or I could draw these in with a colored pencil or water-soluble pencil. But you can see where I've lifted that, it just gives enough of that tonal quality, the difference in the color value, to give the idea of something's going on there. You know, it's not going to be super hyper realistic. I have to admit, I am not a super hyper realistic painter. So if you're looking to do that, you're going to need to practice a whole lot. You're not going to really get that from me. I basically just, I paint fast and loose and get the idea and the concept of the flower down. And, you know, I think it gives the idea of the plant that I'm painting, and I'm good with that. So, so any questions before we move on and do a whole sheet with the whole geranium? Okay, and I am going to switch over to my other set because it's got a true red. So I just did an example in pink. So that means that this time I'll do a red one.
Jennifer, you know, this is Roz, and you know, it's weird. We're getting this message periodically that says Jennifer's network bandwidth is low. Now, actually, it just improved. Now it's back to regular. I'm not sure what that is exactly. I don't know. It just means the picture that we're getting is smaller, I guess, than what it is when it's full strength. But right now it's good, so let's just keep going.
Okay, and I'm just checking. My phone's plugged in, so it's got plenty of charge. It's not going to run out of.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
My internet connection. But if I go away, if my screen goes completely black or something, yell.
I will. I'll do that.
Okay. All right. Any questions before we go to the switch over to the red one? Okay. So again, looking at my geranium, there's going to be one of these flowerets, the petals, that's going to be in full view, that's going to be facing you. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of these others that aren't facing you. They're going to be facing top, sideways, and all these other directions. So when I'm painting them, I'm going to kind of take that same approach. So I'm going to paint one that is going to be like in focus if I were to take a photograph of it. that I can see all the detail of. And then maybe one that's kind of obscured and some other petals around the outside that we're not going to see. We're just going to suggest that they're there. So I'm going to go ahead and make this first. Again, rotating the brush and making that first petal shape. Kind of one side of a heart, I guess you'd call it, huh? Kind of like that. And then another petal around the side. Turn your paper if that's more comfortable for you. I'm kind of just turning my hand and turning the brush. Reload your brush when you need to grab some more pigment. And let me know if this, if it's easier to turn your brush than actually paint in a petal. So if I were painting it with a tip, I might paint like a big balloon shape like that. And I just think it's easier to kind of let the brush do the hard work for you. And then I'm gonna dry off my brush a little bit and maybe even drop in some extra water right in the center where these come together so that I can pull back some of the pigmentation. So within this one geranium, we've got all kinds of different intensities going on. The concentration should be sort of toward the back of the petals and get lighter as they come to the center here. Okay, now I'm going to sneak a couple of these around the back. So they're going to be kind of half petals, but I'm going to leave a little bit of white space in there. Just a suggestion that there's some other parts of the geranium back there. These side ones that kind of face sideways might look like butterfly wings.
I have a small question.
Uh-huh.
Did you use the same technique for the back petal as you did for the main ones?
Yeah, I just did curve it all the way around.
Okay.
I just kind of put the top of it in there and, got it close to the edge of the other petals. But if I kept painting, they'd all kind of run together. So I'm leaving a little bit of white space there. And any of these that are in the back, like there's one really low one here as I'm looking at my sample geranium. If you want to give it a slightly different tone, you can, drop in just a little bit of a deeper red or a little bit of a gray or even an orange to modify that, just to kind of suggest that these are in shadow. They're in the background. And while I've got the red going on here, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of these buds. And the buds kind of go, they're kind of like shoot out a little bit from, they're not straight down. They kind of like shoot out a little bit there. So I'm going to hold on putting the greenery in there so that the red has some time to set up a little bit. But I can come down here and start putting in some of the greenery. So again, there are going to be some leaves that you can see the detail, and there are going to be others that are going to be just a suggestion that they're there. So I'm going to pick a leaf to give some detail. And let me see if I'm in view here. Yeah. So these are going to be kind of like lily pads or 4-leaf clovers, whatever you want to call them. They kind of have curly ruffled edges on them. Okay, here's a bonus tip. I wasn't planning on teaching this, but if you have a toothpick, or this is a wooden skewer that I use with my watercolor, while the paint's wet, I've got this leaf where the paper is wet. I can pull some vein work through this geranium leaf, and it's going to create some divots in the paper where I'm doing this scribing technique. And I'm not sure if you can see it. You'll see it when I drop some more color in here. The pigment is going to find those little scratches that I put in the paper, and it's going to follow the lines. So that's going to take a minute to react. Maybe if I push it back a little bit, you'll see. Yeah, you'll see that there. If I pull some of that, you can see. Can you, Roz, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So it'll take a few minutes to react, but you know, this is important to do when the paper's wet. If you scratch it on the paper and you haven't activated it with any water, you won't be as successful with that. But you might want to grab a toothpick or a wooden skewer and try that technique. It's kind of fun just to get a little bit of detail into your leaves. But I could also do it here. My petals are dry, but if I took some pink and dropped it in there just for fun into those 3 petals, I can do the same technique, pull it towards the center and create some vein work in those petals, which is really an interesting thing to play around with, I think. Get some texture into your watercolors. Okay, back to the leaves. I got the main one here. Now I'm just going to have a couple of partial view petals around the side. The curlier the outside of the leaf, the better, I think. And there's even kind of a little offshoot here. I'll go ahead and paint that. All right, now my geranium, the head of the geranium is pretty dry. other than what I just dropped in there. It's not real shiny. So I can add the top crowns to these little buds. That's what I'm calling them. They're just kind of little caps on there. And I can connect them to the underside of the geranium. And then of course there's a main stem that I'm going to sneak right under that petal and come on down. How's everybody doing? Talk to me.
This is fun.
Hanging with me? Now, these that I'm putting in some additional greenery just because, you know, geraniums have a lot of foliage. I'm just going to dance a few of these things around here, but I'm not being very specific at all. And it's mostly water, very little pigment. So they're kind of fading out, if you will. If I want to, I can go down and do the pot and everything that it's in. But for now, let's come back and give a little bit more attention here to the geranium. Okay, if you have a smaller brush and you want to switch over, now would be the time to do it because we're going to put the center in. I'm just going to do a really light touch with my same number 12 brush. If for no other reason, just to prove I can do it. We'll see though, right? I've got my paper towel to mop up anything in case it doesn't work and goes a little haywire. But let's see. I got those babies connected. Maybe put a little bit of more greenery in there. And I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow. So it's a real light spring green, very, very light in the center here. And just add a little spike. And then depending on these other, if you left enough white space between the blooms here, you might see some other, you know, greenery coming down from where it's attached to these other blooms. May or may not see that. It depends, like on this sample, you know, I left some white space in there, so I was able to kind of put those little shoots in there. If you didn't leave enough white space, you might not be able to. So that you can try on your next practice round. And if I had a really, really deep red, this is how I do a deep red. If I just have the one red, let me go back to my practice sheet so I can show you. This is my red. If I want a real deep red to put in a few wisps of details in the veins, the way I darken a red is with a little bit of green. So I can take a green and mix just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of that green with the red. And you see how it deepens that red? Really gives it some oomph. So now with that on my brush, I can just put in a few wispy details around the shape of these petals. A little bit of shading here and there. Now at this point, I can just take a look at my overall flower and decide if anything needs to be kind of tweaked a little bit, if I need any shading, if I need to round out the globe of the petals anymore, like I could maybe sneak in a little petal over here. You know, it's all up to you. No, I don't like that. I'm gonna pull that back. Okay. All right, so what was I saying? Shading, you can decide, you know, if there's anything that needs to be adjusted. I can see right away that my green in the center here kind of took off down one of those pathways that I scratched into with the skewer. So I'm just going to pull some of that back, lift it a little bit. I'm not super bothered by it. I think it looks really natural. Can drop in any sort of shading, or if I want to modify these colors at all, like I think I dropped in some pink into the red. Geraniums are so colorful, you know, if you just looked at the color of them, they really do have different tones in them, like the lipstick red and, you know, the cherry red, the tomato reds, the fiery pinks, you know, so you might want to actually take some time and do some color mixing to figure out how to really capture that. And of course, at some point, I just have to stop fiddling with this and let it rest and completely dry. Background. In the card examples that I showed you, I really did not put in much of a background. I just kind of let the greenery do its thing. But if you wanted to do a background, there's a subtle background in this one. You can barely see it because it's such a light lime green. But what I do with the background is make sure that everything is dry, because you don't want to end up getting too close to all of your subject that you spent a long time capturing, and then you happen to hit something that's already wet and then it all bleeds together. So you want to make sure that everything is really dry. And in order to achieve that, I also give it enough white space. So when I'm painting in a background, I kind of do a whole lot of water and just a little pigment, and then just reload my brush with extra water and pull that color around. But I don't paint right up to my image. I leave a little bit of breathing space just in case anything is still wet and I don't want to have the colors bleed inadvertently. So I might, you know, dance in a little bit of that background underneath, and this is where I work, you know, really fast. I kind of just sneak it in. If it's dry though, you know, if my main subject is dry, if I overlap a little bit of blue into this petal, nothing's really going to happen. And I've got my paper towel, you know, just in case. You can blot anything if it goes haywire.
Jennifer, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Someone says, I'm getting a darker line around the edge of my petals. Is this because I'm using tube paints?
No, it could be your ratio of water. So let me grab another sample of another piece that I did, and let me show you what happens if you're let me show you what happens. Pictures are always better for me to help explain. Let me see if I can find my sample. All right, so here is a sample of pansies and violas, I guess, that I painted earlier in the week. And you'll notice with a lot of water and some of your more earthy colors, it will really granulate, or another word watercolorists call this is bloom. So this is, again, one of those really unique things that happens with watercolor paint, where it just kind of takes off. And if you get the color where you want it and you drop in extra water, like I did with this leaf up at the top here, then this wonderful bloom or granulation will happen, and the pigment will settle randomly where you've brushed in extra water. So this could be a result, this could be happening where the pigment is pooling around the edge of your petal, where you've kind of pushed it and then watered in the rest of your petal. So it might be doing that on its own, which is a really beautiful thing. You know, some people really love watercolor for that reason. So if you're curious about, you know, what that's going to do, you're not going to really be able to tell in the time that it's taken us to really paint from start to finish here. But what I would recommend is, with your paint set, take your paints and do what I would call a value scale. So this would be taking this pink in what I would consider a normal paint to water ratio and put that down, and then put more water on your brush without reloading it in the paint, and put another swatch next to it, and then go for more water, no paint, more water, and do another swatch next to it, and then go into the water and without in the paint, another swatch. So I've got 4 different color swatches here, going from what I consider to be a normal watercolor ratio to like 70% to like 40% to like 10%. I don't know. So play with your brand of paints and push the amount of water you can use with them without going back in and grabbing more pigment, and let this dry. Now this is going to look completely different in about an hour when this completely dries. It's got a tonal quality right now because it's shiny, and that's the water reflecting light. But once the water completely evaporates, these are going to look so completely different because the pigment is going to settle in depending on where the water is. And, you know, I'm tipping this around as I'm talking and it's rolling around. So where it settles, it's going to do some beautiful things. And that's part of the beauty of this medium. So if you're new to using either a brand new set of paints that you're not familiar with the brand, or if you're completely new to watercolor painting, it helps to do some of these kind of test strips. And do another good idea is just to take random colors and put them down, and then take another random color. You don't even have to look, just grab another random color. And here's a brown and a blue, and I'm going to dot them next to each other and let them react. And again, when I come back in an hour, this is going to look totally different. So did that help? Or did I just completely over explain something that needed a simple explanation? Now, the other thing that you can do, and this is the last thing I'll say about adding any detail to your painting, is if you happen to have a watercolor pencil set or any water soluble pencils. I love this set because it's very highly pigmented. It's made by Derwent. It's called Ink Tense. Ink Tense pencils are called ink pencils, but anything that says water soluble or that's a watercolor pencil will do the same thing. If you feel like you have more control over sketching in fine details like the center of this geranium versus using a brush, then use the tool that's best suited for you and sketch in those details. So I could, you know, make a couple of roughly lines around these leaves here and there. I could switch over to a magenta pencil and outline, not every leaf, but you know, a few details here and there. And the nice thing about these pencils, because they're water soluble, is I can take just water on my brush and trace where I've sketched in these details, and it will liquefy and blend with my watercolor. So if I didn't like something, I could totally liquefy it, work my brush and get it totally to blend and disappear. But I quite like the kind of juxtaposition between a brush stroke and a sketched line. I think that's just really cool. But then again, I do a lot with mixed media, so I'm usually doing more than one medium. It's hard for me to stay with just one medium, do just watercolor. So I had to show you that Renism colored pencil. And just that little touch made it a mixed media piece. Okay, so can I answer any questions before we kind of do show and tell? And I turn my phone around so I can see what you all did.
Jennifer, that really looks beautiful. Gorgeous.
Thank you. So getting back to the beginning of class, modifying your colors. You can very easily, you know, like I demonstrated, I started with hot pink and then I moved here to the red. I forgot to add my little blooms over here. Need just a little something there. So I started demonstrating with the hot pink, then I did this version in red. You can do any color as long as you know this technique with the florets and building around one main cluster of petals and moving on from there. This can be done in any color. You can create any color geranium you'd like. It's also very similar to a hydrangea. If you studied a hydrangea bloom, it would have all of these clusters, or lilacs. Lilacs would be the same idea, but tiny, tiny miniature little flowerets. Once you kind of know this technique, you can study other multi-petal flowers and practice on other species of flowers. So any questions? You need to see anything again or have me go back over anything? I'll give you a close-up look there.